Reflections from the day, just while we're waiting for Sue. When, during yesterday and today, did you feel excited or engaged? And anyone can talk. Simple question, when did you feel excited or engaged about what was going on? No one ever felt excited? All right, we'll ask the opposite question. When did you feel like we were stuck or treading water over the course of the 2 days? And what about it?
I gave you my... That was it.
Okay, is it on? I felt like yesterday was a lot of talk about a lot of big things, and I didn't feel like we were going to get anywhere. What'd you say, a slurry? Circular, yeah, round and round. And so today I felt like there was, I don't know that it was more focus, but just we seemed to get there a little bit better.
You ever feel in your work, your day-to-day work, when you're in the office, like you're having these circular discussions?
Yes.
All right, so it was nothing new, but you were feeling that way. What else? Where else do people feel stuck or feel like you're treading water? We have one down here.
So I think while it was really, really good yesterday to have the diversity on the panel, and that was the goal, and it did it did create a little bit of that stuckness because the panels were so diverse and it seemed like they were in different places. But I think that actually helped today be more focused, and so I would say after yesterday morning's panel sessions, I began to feel excited. So there are two answers for you.
So when you're thinking about the information that we covered over the past couple of days, where were you left wanting to know more about what was going on? Where could we have had a whole another panel session about a topic? Can you get mic'd up and go over there? Where did we not talk enough?
Cobb, LA. One of the things that came up during our clinical networks group was that had been missing was a focus on collection of specimens and sample processing protocols. We identified that having samples available to better describe the phenotype, the impact on the patient, and whether medical countermeasures worked or not. For example, you might want to know what the concentration of the drug was in the body if the patient didn't get it for whatever reason, or it wasn't absorbed, for example, in someone who's critically ill. That would be very helpful to know. And we didn't spend much time talking about specimens and biorepositories. How do you collect it? How do you process it? Where does it get stored? The Ebola samples, I think, had to be destroyed. What was it, Chris, in 10 days?
Yeah, so the new DSAT regulations are 7 days following completion treatment. Either need to transfer to Yeah, so the new regulations from DSAT are that within 7 days of completion of treatment, they need to be destroyed or transferred to a level 4 lab.
So that was a whole element that just wasn't covered in this. And as Boris stated before, this is complex, and we may not have gotten to everything.
Yeah, and the other issue is just transport of the samples. There's very few carriers that will transport them. And if they are transported for clinical, it can take multiple days to a week to get them transported.
Great. All right, so I think all of our team captains are here. I'm going to invite, I think, Boris first, just to share your reflections on the really long break that we took. And then we'll hear from Perren and Sue, and then Boris will close us out with some concluding comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. So our group was concept of operations, although the caveat here and the rules that all three of us, so we need not repeat this perhaps, although maybe is that because of sort of the rules of the road, right, this isn't some sort of consensus building working group. We're not coming up, as I mentioned multiple times, recommendations. It's the sense is all of us came in with our knowledge base and perhaps our biases. We, as coordinators of the subsections, masters of ceremony, band conductors, listened to what was going on. We were part of the conversation. And what we've been told is at the end of this that we take in information, the biases we had before. So the knowledge base that Boris had last week actually applies to this. But we now are altered by the great discussions that we had in each of our little sessions this afternoon. And so those of you in my work group will understand where Boris perhaps inserts his own ideas. And you'll say, well, that's a lie, that never took place. That's because I just gave in that disclaimer. And others will say, well, he's following exactly what the work group said, so he has no novel ideas. And that may be because the work group was so good that, in fact, it reflects my feelings. The rest of us who weren't part of that work group won't know what the truth is. Right? And much like my CV is only 50% correct, you have no idea which 50% of that is in fact correct. I'm just kidding on the CV thing. I would have. Anyhow, so the concept of operations, and we're defining the work that we looked at. We began looking at things as, and here's the image, right? So if we're looking at concept of operations for the assessment and monitoring of medical countermeasures, that the imagery I had beforehand, that in essence we in fact expanded upon a little bit, is one of a set of levers. It's a machine. So a concept of operation is the result of a machine being told what to do, right? So it has buttons or levers, and we say at the end, I'm going to put in some information into this machine to build what I want. So imagine in your own minds a lot of dials, and we kind of looked at handles, right? I kind of like the Wizard of Oz as an analogy because so much of government is in fact the man behind the curtain who appears to be a wizard, but when the little dog pulls the curtain away, it's just a man behind the curtain. And what we have here is the ability for us to pull levers. And in fact, we talk about concept of operation and defining the problem. We kind of looked at it and saying, okay, we realize that there are multiple parameters that define the scope of the problem. And these parameters include the type of medical countermeasure we're talking about, right? The specific product. And it's not to say that we need CONOPS to that level of specificity. We will at some point hopefully achieve that. But because we have pretty much nothing now, how do we group things accordingly? So one lever is that I put in, I pull it down, and it says type of product, and I press in some necessary parameters. An also important part of the lever system is what type of emergency am I dealing with? And we described it as sort of as, you know, not we, I viewed it as three different realms, right? There's the specific small incident, small, let's say 50, 100 people. It's undefined, but it's containable. And what you say is, okay, if I'm looking for concept of operations for the assessment and monitoring of medical countermeasures, and I have a bunch of people who just showed up in my ER, or in my hospital, or in a few hospitals, it's different than what we saw in 2001, the anthrax, which is multiple municipalities involved with a larger denominator. And it's different than the pandemic, where we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions involved. And so the next lever is type of emergency, because in essence, the type of CONOP I throw in there will be determined not only by the medical countermeasure involved and its specific parameters, but in fact the type of emergency. Also included in this machine that puts out a CONOP is the specifics of, yes, the regulatory status of that medical countermeasure. So if I have a product that, for example, is fully approved for a specific indication, I may need information, but it may not be as full of information, a CONOP, that in essence says, well, this is a total product that's only been looked at the animal rule, we're putting it under IND or EUA, and so if I put that parameter in there, it's going to say you're going to need a whole lot more information. That's how much time I have left? Seriously. Why, I can go on. Anyhow, so that's point number one. So at the end of all this, we've decided that when you push these levers, type of medical countermeasure product, type of public health emergency, right? Type, and embedded in the public health emergency is how are we also distributing this product? How are we dispensing it? Is it being given at that hospital? Is it being given at a pod? Is it being given by physicians or pharmacies in the community? That plays a role, and that's related with type of. So in essence, the scope is really dependent on the situation. We realize that these parameters, these levers need to be pulled for us to be able to say this is the type of CONOP that we need. In terms of stakeholders, the second component, right, HHS is the lead on these CONOPs. It's within ESF 8. It's within the aspects of the responsibility level of multiple components of HHS to include ASPR, BARDA, SNS, FDA, CDC, NIH, the bigger FEMC model. But then we had a whole line listing that included other federal agencies within the support function of public health emergencies. Federal data stakeholders, in other words, federal agencies that have data that may be applicable, need to be part of the stakeholder group. State and local, county, municipal level stakeholders, tribal and territorial entities, variety of associations, which included everything from ASTO and NACHO and hospital associations to healthcare provider organizations, and those within the community, faith-based organizations. The private sector, big pharma, small pharma, medium-sized pharma, manufacturers, academia. So the stakeholders are quite immense within this CONOPS realm. Some of them sitting at the table with the feds designing the CONOPS, but certainly in the whole scheme, ultimately working down to the level of the state and locals who oftentimes will be put into the position of implementing this as important partners of all this. The media, charitable organizations and foundations, and the general population, including special populations. Because at the end of the day, the whole idea of CONOPS for these countermeasures is going to fall into the hands of an individual taking a pill who then is going to be asked to provide some connectivity, some information. We looked at opposition groups within the stakeholders, and we looked at the idea that some of these are in fact our friends until we realize that they may not totally be on board with our approaches, right? State and locals were listed under opposition, not from a sense of their spirit, but in essence, as we've heard this before, the workload issue. If we put too much burden on the state and local people, they're going to say is no, no, not again. You're telling me what to do and I don't have the resources. But includes others that would be actually opposed to us having CONOPS. Bad people, right? Bioterrorist type organizations that would be involved in that don't want these CONOPS. Perhaps our anti-vax groups should be listed there, right, where we have a dilemma already. Privacy advocates aren't the enemy, but in essence would need to be worked at from that perspective to be assured that we're doing. Snake oil type people, people who are selling products that don't want to be part of this. Challenges, funding, politics, political will, personnel workload, the siloed work, communication, bureaucracy. Opportunities within this is we validate current approaches, right? What a better way of validating the concept of an animal rule if not to be able to get that data that's important for us. Decreasing risk of these products, priority setting for CONOPS, saving lives by implementing those CONOPS, refining approaches. And the 5 solutions that I have a few seconds to deal with is basically this is what can be done in the next year. So these are solutions. Explore use of clinical trial network for countermeasures. In other words, start building up these CONOPS. It was described to us as if within the realm of BARDA and SNS, we may have loose CONOPS. Turn the loosey-gooseys into something more concrete, and one way of doing that is already in a proposed potential BARDA tabletop exercise. Let's start building this now. This allows us to share information. Let's further understand the data that's needed. We talked about what data is needed, but in those specific categories, right, for a specific countermeasure, we can start doing that. We can start building this up. So there's a potential SNS workshop that would come out of this. And this is, again, we're not forcing people. We're not saying you're going to do this. These are the people in the room saying, I think we can do this. Communication strategy to market the product, the problems around MCMs, and explain the value added of these CONOPs. Like in forums like Health 2.0, right? Demonstrate the need. So it's a communication scheme that can come from this, using the proceedings as that entry point of communication. Industry, right? Leverage industry to solve the issue. Landscape, evaluation of existing systems at the state and local level, working through NATO, for example, right? Working with those groups, saying what's going on right now. That's doable in the next year. And then building further partnerships as part of our communication schemes for groups that were, honestly, underrepresented or non-represented at this workshop. Payers, for example. CMS wasn't in the room here, right? And other private payers. I think we had, honestly speaking, and I give the accolades to the industry people who are in the room here. That's great, but I think we're underrepresented on that front. IRBs and groups that represent that underrepresented. So I think we have a tasking to be able to promulgate further information as fit. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Boris. Perren, take it away.
Hear me? Okay. So how much of Boris's time do I need to make up? Here we go. You ready? All right, go. So this is when I slow down and speak. No, I'm not going to do that. So I want to first thank everyone who participated in our group. I'm reporting. What I'm going to tell you now are my opinions informed by the discussion. Did I say that right? Informed by the discussion. I agree with what Boris said at the beginning. So clinical networks, I observe the following, or my opinions are informed by the group include as a problem statement, we wish to submit, or I wish to submit, the development of an extensible clinical system for monitoring and assessment of medical countermeasures. That is, number 1, rapid. Number 2, adaptable. Number 3, scientifically robust. And number 4, minimally disruptive to usual care, or the care the clinicians are providing at the bedside. So that's our problem statement. We have 4 considerations as we consider my recommendation for a problem statement. One of them is the developmental stage of the medical countermeasures, whether it's a brand new countermeasure that would come out maybe as a phase 1 drug, or whether it's phase 3, phase 4, maybe at the point of approval, but under the animal rule we don't have data, et cetera. We think there'll need to be different strategies to address medical countermeasures at different stages of development. Number 2, the type of research and the intervention that is anticipated, whether it would be an interventional study, whether it would be an observational study, whether it's acute and we need information real time, or whether it's more of a chronic study, a study of a disease chronicity looking at longer term outcomes. I also think it's important to look at the nature and the scale of the public health emergencies. We imagine that most of these would be on a smaller scale and local. And that response for building a clinical system to gather information with regard to monitoring and assessing medical countermeasures might be different than a national or a global epidemic, for example. So we need to take that into consideration. And finally, the class of medical countermeasure, whether it's a drug, a biologic, or device, or maybe some combination thereof. So those are the 4 considerations as we look at the problem statement. The stakeholders are very similar to the group that Boris identified, so I won't rehash that at the USG level, local, regional, industry, et cetera. But there are a few groups that we think are important with regard to clinical network. The first is the engagement of professional organizations, of professional societies, which in aggregate can represent most, if not all, of the clinicians at the bedside, who think it's important to have their input because they represent stakeholders from a bedside clinician standpoint, and they also typically have well-developed and powerful say at a government level. Speaking of government, we think it's important to engage politicians. We're looking at engaging patients and families and advocacy groups on behalf of patients as we consider human subjects review. We need the media involved because we're talking about giving agents medical countermeasures to patients, and we don't want them to feel like they're guinea pigs. We want them to feel like they're important, that our responsibility is to them as providers to make sure that the agents that we're providing to them are as safe and effective as possible. And how do we get that message across? There's a lot of sensitivity built into that. And then also the payers that Boris mentioned. We then went into analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you charged me, my dear friend, with focusing on the positive, so we're ignoring weaknesses and threats. I'm only going to report on the opportunities and the strengths that we have. How about that? So from a strength standpoint, although we have those listed and they're recorded, we can talk about my thoughts that were informed by the discussion for weaknesses and threats. Bless you. From a strength standpoint, we have infrastructure available that we can leverage. We have great resources and great expertise that we can bring to the discussion. Innovations, improvement towards public-private partnerships. We think we have a lot of strengths there. And I have a lot of experience with past public health emergencies, whether on U.S. soil or elsewhere around the world. Opportunities, looking at case studies from past public health emergencies, in particular the Ebola experience, to test protocols for predictable threats like seasonal influenza, to socialize the issue and get the message out to the public. And we think that it's important from an opportunity standpoint to be able to conduct annual exercises, fail once, fail twice, fail better, to paraphrase Beckett. Solutions. Number one, in the next year, come up with a playbook of potential scenarios and a framework for evaluating against available data sources, at the very least an outline of what that might look like, and then be able to fill the outline and address gaps over time. Number two, annual exercises and tabletops to test feasibility and provide proof of concept. Number three, to identify and address leadership gaps and our inability currently to be able to identify a single individual or agency who's responsible from an authority and responsibility standpoint for the creation of a network of networks to conduct research during public health emergencies. We're interested in building up private PPPs, public-private partnerships, to continue the conversation among stakeholders and, importantly, our industry sponsors. And then finally, we believe it would be helpful to create an advisory board for administrative preparedness that would allow us in this first year to address the very thorny but very important issue of human subjects protection. And then finally, value added, we have a sixth solution, count them, and that's to engage our friends in the ConOps group and in the data group as we move forward and plan strategically. Those are my thoughts informed by the discussion. Do we have time for questions? No. No questions. Okay. Thank you very much. Where did Sue go? Oh, here she is. Hi, Sue.
We're going to hand it off.
Thank you. Did we make up any time?
We're doing great.
Okay, good.
I thought it was going to be brief, and I might even be briefer because my reflections are similar to something that just got mentioned as well. So my reflections on conversations were around the issue of how can we take advantage of existing data structures, systems, et cetera, to assess the efficacy and the safety of MCM. So in terms of, there was discussion, we were thinking about it both from the perspective of a broad set of stakeholders who could potentially be both data suppliers and data users of different types, people who might be more on doing the data users from the perspective of analysis or policy decision making, or other types of thinking about different types of actionable data. In terms of really thinking about stakeholders, it kind of came down to almost everyone, and it depends upon the particular scenario, whether all the same players would be at the table. Importantly, we thought a lot about special populations whose voices aren't always there, and thinking about it from the perspective of data, although issues of digital divide from an access perspective have definitely improved through the years. There still are issues in Indian country and other parts of our nation which don't have the broadband even to do some basic kinds of things. And we also were thinking about the perspective of other types of populations, including children who are very vulnerable, and of course, who don't, not necessarily, we want them at the table, but we, or necessarily dining next to us, but we do want, do want to make sure that perspective ends up being, that perspective is being represented. In terms of really thinking about, and people we're public health people too, but we did come up with challenges, not only thinking about opportunities. So just thinking about some potential challenges from my reflections. Some of them are technical, but others are not. So in terms of technical, just we still do, having adequate standards for semantic operability, we're still not there. Things such as FHIR are helpful, but they're not the answer to everything. So some standardizations can still present a challenge. Other types of data access can be a challenge, not only from the technical aspect, but also very much from the governance aspect, and needing access to data sources when you might not have a useful data use agreement in place. In terms of thinking about other types of challenges, another type of challenge ended up being around workforce, and particularly the workforce that would have the type of data science skills that would be able to wrangle an increasingly broad variety of data sources, and to get them ready for not only computation but also human interpretation, and having a shortage in that area of workforce, and also thinking about the different ways you might get that workforce, whether it would be through some type of contract or service agreement versus having people that might be permanently within an agency. Let's see, my memory's not there. The other thing was really, and even starting with our planning committee calls, Perren would constantly say, we need to practice, we need to exercise. You just can't. And so the whole notion of that we really don't have a testing plan from the perspective of the readiness of the data and the data transfers and transformations that would be needed. So those were some of the types of challenges. In terms of thinking about the solutions, one of the things, reflecting on one of the things that we spent a lot of time discussing, was quite similar to what the clinical networks group ended up talking about, but it was talking about a data preparedness framework, and not only a framework that would be developed, but then having an actual testing plan and testing exercise that could happen, and thinking about what some of the components of those things could be. Similarly, use case scenarios. But then in thinking about data sources, what data sources would be useful to answer what questions at what point in time. So in terms of thinking about the opportunities, we thought about the opportunities that do come from social media, such as Twitter, information that could come out of looking at what queries were done through search engines and having those types of log files, which could potentially provide some useful information. But in everything, it's always having the right data source to match the right question. So having a good sense of, within some type of data preparedness framework, which data source for which purpose, kind of level of veracity of the, thinking about the veracity of the various types of data sources, thinking about the various types of governance, which is often a challenge, and what structures could you put in place. There are many existing data use agreements, but would it be data use agreement templates, but would it be possible as part of a data preparedness plan to create some priority data use agreements and get them kind of exercised ahead of time? For example, if it would be important to access a pharmacy benefit system or an Aetna or Blue Shield, or think about other types of databases that could be useful, would it be possible to kind of build that trusting relationship and get that executed ahead of time? Was that the signal to end?
You can finish the solution.
Okay. Well, and then another part of that would end up being what would be the necessary supporting standards, because we have standards in many areas, but figuring out which would be missing and additional needed things for this particular purpose, and then really thinking truly about what some of the human capacity would be. And so I actually bunched several of our solutions under that one idea. And then we also spent some time discussing an idea that had been floated earlier in the day about how to take advantage of the capacity of commercial pharmacies, and the notion of being able to create a pop-up pharmacy, take it to a great area of great need, take advantage of their existing data sources and IDs that might already be in place. So something like a CVS or a Walmart or something, pop-up pharmacy, and then have alternative methods of creating IDs on the spot, for people that wouldn't already be in that. And so you'd have kind of different levels of data on the people that would be given the medical countermeasure, but at least you'd have some basic data on everyone that then could be for follow-up and other evaluation purposes.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone whose discussion I've reflected on.
All right, so that's it for reflections. A quick round of applause for everyone for working hard during that. I know it was a lot of work. Thank you for going the last mile with us. And Boris, will you talk to us about after the last mile?